Okay. So why don't we start? Because I know you have a lot that you want to share with us this morning. Hello and welcome to our series on confronting racism, discrimination, and othering, perspectives from around the world. I'm Dr. Maria Nardone, Director of Technology and Global Learning at the William Allenson White Institute. Before we begin today, I'd like to have a moment of silence. There are many conflicts raging around the world and many innocent people are suffering. So if we can hold them in our thoughts this morning for a minute before we begin. Thank you. For those of you who joined our series last year, you know we began our studies in the United States and we heard from speakers around the globe. Today, we once again turn our focus to the United States and the internment of Japanese during World War II. We are fortunate to have Professor Duncan Williams as our guest today. Dr. Robert Langen will be our moderator. Professor Duncan RYUKEN Williams was born in Tokyo, Japan, to a Japanese mother and British father. After growing up in Japan and England until age 17, he moved to the United States to attend Reed College and Harvard University, where he received a PhD in religion. Williams is currently professor of religion and East Asian languages and cultures and the director of the USC Shinzo Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture. He is former chair of USC's School of Religion, and previously he held the Shinzo Ito Distinguished Chair of Japanese Buddhism at UC Berkeley. He served as the director of Berkeley's Center for Japanese Studies for 4 years. He also has been ordained since 1993 as a Buddhist priest in the Soto Zen tradition and served as the Buddhist chaplain at Harvard University from 1994 to 1996. He is the author of The Other Side of Zen, A Social History of Soto Zen Buddhism in Tokugawa, Japan, and editor of 7 volumes, including Hapa Japan, Izai Buddhism in the Americas, American Buddhism, and Buddhism and Ecology. He has also translated 4 books from Japanese into English, including Putting Buddhism to Work, A New Theory of Economics and Business Management. His latest book is American Sutra, A Story of Faith and Freedom in the Second World War, which got up to number 3 on the LA Times bestseller list for nonfiction. He has previously received research grants from the American Academy of Religion, Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Lilly Endowment, the Japanese Foundation, the Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science, the Numata Foundation, Society for Promotion of Buddhism. In 2011, Professor Williams received a commendation from the Japanese government for deepening the mutual understanding between the peoples of Japan and California. So welcome, Dr. Williams. Our moderator today is Dr. Robert Langen, who is supervising and training psychoanalyst on the faculty and a fellow emeritus of the William Allenson White Institute. He is in private practice in New York City. He has written and lectured widely on the nature of analytic change and the relationship between Buddhism and psychoanalysis. We're very happy to have both of you here today. So without any further from me, I will turn the program over to you.
So let's launch into it.
All right.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the kind introduction. And it's wonderful to be here with you all at the William Allison White Institute. And I understand this is a series about confronting racism, discrimination, and othering. And so I'll be speaking from the vantage point, as was mentioned earlier, like from my scholarship in terms of the book I wrote most recently, which talks about World War II Japanese American incarceration and what that means in thinking about issues around race and discrimination and exclusion in Asian American history. But also I'm happy to speak kind of from my perspective as a Buddhist priest and in our community in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. In recent times, as you may know, there's been many kind of incidents of anti-Asian racism and discrimination, animus, and even violence. And in our local temples, we've experienced many kinds of incidents of vandalism and so forth in this kind of rise in anti-Asian sentiment in the United States. And so today I'll be speaking from that kind of vantage point, and then maybe I'll share some slides to kind of help make my presentation. And then I'm hoping Bob and I can have some conversation and then maybe take some of your questions as well. So if you give me 1 second, I'm gonna share my screen and go from there. So I think I mentioned, this is something that even maybe those of you outside of the Asian American community know that just a year and a few months ago, we had an important kind of case of, there's been so many cases, of course, of anti-Asian discrimination and even violence, but one of the ones that caught the national attention, even featured in the New York Times, was the incident that got caught on the security footage where elderly Asian American gentleman, Wicha Ratanapakdi, based in San Francisco, a Thai American Buddhist individual, was just senselessly, he was taking a daily his walk, and somebody just attacked him. And that kind of incident was captured, because it was captured on camera, it kind of went viral. And I think that, and then the subsequent incident in Atlanta, Georgia, probably were the two incidents that last year really put this anti-Asian, most recent wave of anti-Asian animus and violence into the national spotlight. Here in our area, as I mentioned, it's not my temple, but two temples over, a couple blocks over, Higashi Honganji Temple in Little Tokyo, one of 5 Buddhist temples in our neighborhood, was subjected to vandalism of the outdoor lantern and the arson attempt as well. And this followed on the heels of, I think, it was quite a few, maybe 6 or 7 incidents in 1 month that preceded it a little bit further south of us in Orange County, which is the largest community of Vietnamese people outside of Vietnam, located in Little Saigon area of Orange County. And many Buddhist temples were vandalized there as well at the height of some of this anti-Asian sentiment in the United States. Here you see one statue where the graffiti or defacement of the Buddhist statues is linked to, the word Jesus is put on the back of it. And so one of the things I'm going to be talking about today is where, when we think about racism in this country or discrimination, othering, the topics that all of you have been focused on, I'm going to try to introduce something where I'm going to make an argument today that it's not just about race, but it's where race and religion often intersect and get conflated. And this is an issue not just for Buddhist people, as I'll talk about today, but I think you'll probably more well aware of the same type of conflation that happens with Jewish Americans, Muslim Americans, Hindu Americans, other people for whom race and religion often are not so extricable. And so I guess what I wanted to do today was give a couple of kind of keywords that I hope to, from a kind of Buddhist vantage point, use to frame this discussion, and then go through some slides to make the case that of this kind of where race and religion kind of are conflated in American way of thinking about race and discrimination and othering, and that this has a very long history. So that's going to be kind of my other point. The recent anti-Asian stuff is not, unique, or it's happened before. So the first term in Japanese Buddhist term, we call it do or nichi, means usually translated as way or path, but it's really about a kind of map or orientation to various things. And so one of the things I wanted to do just at the top was share with you a few orienting kind of maps of how these histories of racism and discrimination come together. And so one map I wanted to show you is, this is a very simple one about all of the different confinement sites of various kinds, internment camps run by Department of Justice and U.S. Army, concentration camps run by the War Relocation Authority, temporary detention facilities run by the INS. And so there's roughly 125,000 persons of Japanese ancestry who were suddenly forcibly removed and placed in these camps in indefinite incarceration. And this is probably something you'll roughly know, that this is just one, unfortunate moment in American history where one particular group is being targeted for racialized discrimination. But this is a different map I wanted to show you that I think tells a kind of different understanding of what is America that affects the first map. And so this is a map where, as was mentioned in the intro, I used to be a professor at UC Berkeley, and it's founded when the regents of the school were looking across the Pacific, and one of them thought of the poem by the British Anglican bishop and poet and philosopher George Berkeley, and that's why the university in the town is called that. They were thinking about this poem, America, and in particular this stanza, "Westward the course of empire takes its way. The first four acts already past, the fifth shall close the drama with the day. Time's noblest offspring is the last." And so this is obviously based on a much larger way of thinking about the story of America, that it's part of some kind of manifest destiny, that the making of America is kind of leaving behind an old world that is, in this other stanza says, Europe breeds in its decay, and a kind of new world that is being moved ever westward. And that kind of idea of the westward expansion and the kind of supposed bringing in of civilization into a previously uncivilized place, which is, of course, there's already a civilization of native peoples in America, so it's not as if it wasn't there, but a certain kind of civilization, a Christian civilization that would make up the territorial expansion that would be, in some sense, ordained by God. So that's kind of one kind of storyline of the making of America. That's I'm not the first person to point this out. It's a fairly common way of thinking about how America was developed. And so the third map I want to show you is a kind of Buddhist map that and a different poem, one from the World War II Japanese American incarceration period, written by a Buddhist priest called Nyogen Senzaki. And he's talking in this poem titled "Leaving Santa Anita" about leaving a horse stall, which is where he found himself in the spring of 1942, forcibly removed like everybody else in the community. And he's talking about going to a more permanent detention facility in Wyoming called Heart Mountain. And this is his poem. This morning, the winding train, like a big black snake, takes us as far as Wyoming. The current of Buddhist thought always runs eastward. This policy may support the tendency of the teaching. Who knows? So this policy, meaning the US Army's policy of forcibly rounding people up and putting them into camps in increasingly remote areas away from the Pacific coast. He's making this comment about going to Wyoming from this Santa Anita horse racing track, which is where he was initially placed, as supporting something, a doctrine called Bukkyo Tozen in the Japanese. It's in the characters up on top of the slide, but which in English is translated usually the eastward advance or movement of Buddhism. And this comes from the basic idea in Japan. For example, in the early 8th and 9th century texts, they would talk about how Buddhism began in India, and before the Buddha died, he talked about how he would no longer be physically present, but that his dharma or his teachings would remain, and that he prophesied that they would move eastward, and then from moving eastward, it would disseminate to the 10,000 directions. And so it just means like it would move east and kind of spread around the world. That kind of idea was something he in the early texts prophesied. And so back in World War II, Nyogen Sensaki's referencing that idea of the Buddha's prophecy being, in some sense, fulfilled by him moving from Santa Anita, California to Wyoming, Heart Mountain camp in Wyoming. And so this is a different vantage point in the idea of America, because obviously for Asian immigrants, that westward movement of America that in this previous slide doesn't make any sense, because their making of America is immigrating in the 19th century to Hawaii, then to the Pacific coast, and then on eastward. And so for Asian immigrants to America, this particular westward movement story doesn't make a lot of sense. And if you think about, Mexican American, like Central American people from South America, like their American story is also a little bit different than this particular kind of version. And so I wanted to first talk about that as one kind of set of orientations or maps that may help us enter a discussion of where does Asian America and what fit in the discussion of race in America, discrimination in America, and where does Asian American people fit into the American story? Because I think that's one of the biggest factors as to why all of this animus and continued animus and even violence is going on around Asian Americans, and especially during the pandemic period, is because Asian Americans are viewed as perpetual foreigners who can never quite fit into one kind of version of the American story. And so this is a sketch of that monk, Reverend Nyogen Senzaki, who is a sketch of him teaching Buddhism classes in Heart Mountain in Wyoming. So the second word I want to talk about is this word called interlinked or goen, that things have karmic conditions that build our linkages or relations with each other. I personally got into this kind of area of study because my own professor's father left a diary written in Japanese about his time in one of these camps, to be more specific, Manzanar camp in Eastern California. And my process of engaging this material came from translating this diary from Japanese into English. But what I found out as I began to explore the topic, this is maybe 20 years ago at this juncture, of why were people like my professor's father taken and put in these camps. One of the most interesting kind of new piece of information I found in the course of researching at the National Archives was that the very first person picked up by the FBI this is even before the smoke had cleared on Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, 1941, was Reverend Gikyo Kuchiba. He was the head Buddhist priest of a large Buddhist temple, the largest Buddhist temple in Honolulu. And the second Buddhist person picked up was somebody in my lineage of Buddhism, Soto Zen Buddhism, at our temple in Honolulu. And so I was beginning to question why it was that in a time of war, if one is concerned as an intelligence agency around national security, sabotage, espionage, things like that, why would Buddhist priests and not say, I don't know, consulate officials or fishermen, because the attack at Pearl Harbor was obviously in the harbor and at sea, like why would they not be first in line to be arrested for questioning, etc.? Why were Buddhist priests picked up and why were they considered so dangerous? And to answer that question, we have to kind of look further back. You can see here, this is an arrest record and warrant of arrest from the FBI for a different Buddhist priest, Reverend Buntetsu Miyamoto. And you can see here, he's classed in something called Group A. Individuals believed to be most dangerous, in all probability, should be turned in the event of war. In other words, prior to Pearl Harbor, the intelligence agencies, the FBI, ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence, Army G2, they had all worked together for years, as far back as my research found that as far back as 1938, quite a few years prior to Pearl Harbor, all of the intelligence agencies had presumed that war with Japan would happen, and that various people were put into different classifications of national security threat, including Buddhist priests on the Hawaiian Islands were considered as a group of people, a type of person, along with consular officials and so forth, as persons who were in this most dangerous category called Group A, and registries and lists were created accordingly, as were procedures for how to close down radio stations and declare martial law and so forth. All were planned well ahead of Pearl Harbor. And the reason that was so is because, I argue in my book, that there's a much longer history of believing that Buddhism is not only un-American, but anti-American. And this kind of language is most clearly seen in the community prior to the Japanese in America. If we think about the rise in anti-Asian violence in most recent times, it really harkens back all the way to what would eventually become the 1881 Chinese Exclusion Act, the first federal immigration law that said we're going to exclude or say that certain people are not welcome in America. It's the first time the United States had created a law of that kind that targeted one particular group. And the terminology used in the congressional testimony of the era and in the popular press at the time, it was a kind of slur word, the heathen Chinese, meaning the Chinese or the racially unassimilable group that were also heathen or non-Christian, and therefore unable to belong in America. And so the rhetoric of building a symbolic wall in the Pacific, or the talk about an invasion of migrants coming who would, establish a heathen or non-Christian, Buddhist or Tao, like Chinese despotism in San Francisco. This kind of rhetoric preceded the passage of that piece of legislation that kind of legalized discrimination against the Chinese. And of course, that kind of language about the yellow peril, you can see in this Harper's Weekly thing, even though the law had already passed, you can see this idea of one kind of land being illuminated by the Christian cross, being kind of threatened by an ominous cloud with a Buddha in the middle, these dark clouds kind of headed as a kind of danger to a particular idea of a Christian territory. And that kind of idea is replicated, not just targeting Chinese, but in World War II, targeting Japanese, in the same kind of thing. You can see in the other sorry, magazine illustration, the Buddha is you know, or you have a samurai figure behind the Buddha on top of a militarized tank. And so the idea that it's not just that Asian Americans who were like the Japanese American community came over as 99%, you know, Buddhist community, same with the Chinese in the early eras, that they represented not just a un-American thing, but an anti or American kind of group that would somehow subvert the nation and serve as a security risk as well. And so it was that after the initial roundup of Buddhist priests and other leaders in the community, after President Roosevelt in 1942 spring issued Executive Order 9066, the mass roundup of every single person of Japanese ancestry began. At that point, unlike in the previous roundup where, for example, Japanese Christian ministers were kind of left alone. By the time 9066 came around the following spring, the intent of the government was to round up everyone living on the West Coast. It didn't matter if you were Buddhist or Christian. It didn't matter if you were a small child or an infirm grandmother, whether you were a US citizen or an immigrant. Everybody was to be rounded up. And so that process led to people going to places like Reverend Senzaki's horse stables in Santa Anita. This is a picture of Puyallup. It's the county fairgrounds in just south of Seattle, where people in Washington State went. And then this is a picture, though, of something where I want to shift a little bit my discussion about not just what happened to people, but how people responded to it. And so when people went into these temporary assembly centers, euphemistically called, people were told you can take what you can carry. So that meant for most people a single suitcase or two. And you didn't know how long they're going and for what crime. Nobody had charged them with anything. And but they try to make their living quarters as best as they could. But one of the things when they went into the incarceration experience was that officers would check for contraband, and by contraband they were looking for obviously things like cameras or guns, but also they said anything in printed matter like a Buddhist sutra or even a book of Japanese haiku poetry or something, like anything in Japanese in a book form that was considered dangerous and contraband and to be confiscated. And the only two exceptions they had as a rule was if you had a Japanese language version of the Christian Bible, as well as if you had a bilingual, like a English-Japanese language dictionary, a dictionary or a Christian Bible, those two could pass the guards. And so the message that everyone was receiving was that if you learned English, if you haven't already, and you need a dictionary, that's okay. Or if you become Christian, if you haven't already, that's what would demonstrate your loyalty and belonging in America. And so that's the message that people in this community, which was about 80% Buddhist, 20% Christian, Japanese American community at that time. And in this particular image and this photo, you see the family. This is the daughter of Reverend Tansai Terakawa Hiroko playing checkers with her friend Lillian Hayashi on the bed in the living quarters. But you can see they put up a Buddha image and on a big American flag. So not everybody was, how should we say, receiving the government's vantage point as such. They were themselves claiming a place in America, even though it was behind barbed wire with armed guards. They were claiming a place in America that said we can be fully Buddhist and also fully American at the same time. It's a different claim to belonging that despite the kind of attempts to other by the government, they were claiming something else. And so that kind of effort to adapt, become resilient, find a way to persist and persevere through basically forced relocation, indefinite incarceration, in many cases, family separation, and so forth. How do they deal with that? And in Buddhist texts, we have a term in Sanskrit, upaya, or in Japanese way of pronunciation, we call it hoben. It means skillful adaptation. And it comes from the Buddha's teachings itself, that the Buddha skillfully adapted his messages or teachings to whoever was in front of him at the time. And it's kind of like a doctor giving the right prescription, the right dosage, or the right medicine to the patient, not just generically, but to whomever is in front of them, that particular moment, that particular situation. And so for these Buddhist people in the World War II confinement sites, they used what was available. And one further teaching in the Buddhist tradition comes from my lineage of Soto Zen Buddhism. The founder, Dogen, who lived from 1200 to 1253, had a teaching embodied in a book that he called Tenzo Kyokun. Tenzo means the head monastic cook of a monastery, and Kyokun means guidance or instructions. So it's like instructions to the cook. And in it, he talks, of course, about, having the right meditative mindset when you approach food, that you should not waste the food, and many kind of guidances for how to be a good Zen Buddhist, cook in a monastery. But the heart of the book talks about two things. One, that a monastic cook should know, should investigate, be cognizant of all of the ingredients inside the pantry and the kind of kitchen of the monastic kitchen area. And then number two, one should cook with the attitude of not just, it's not about like, I'm a famous chef and not that kind of one, but more like, I'm going to cook it with the right spirit so that it will nourish and sustain the health, physical health, but also spiritual health of all of the Sangha, the training monks in the monastery. And so that kind of teaching is a very kind of classic and well-known one. And but of course, it's a kind of metaphor. The monastic kitchen is actually, yourself. And when you are supposed to look deeply into the pantry to see what you have in there, you're supposed to, kind of scan yourself and see who you are and figure out, maybe you have some ingredients that are good, some maybe not so good, some mediocre ingredients. And the kind of teaching is, even if you have great ingredients, a mediocre cook can still produce a nice meal. But the Buddhist cook is somebody who can take maybe you have some cabbage or daikon radish or something that's kind of going bad. You can still find a way to pickle it, or you can still find a way to use the ingredients that are not so good and transform it. And transform it not just for yourself, but for helping everyone else also prosper and so forth. And so that kind of teaching is the many internees also heard from Buddhist priests in their lectures in camp. And let me give you some examples of how people use what they could find. They found desert wood in the mess hall crates, and made beautiful, Buddhist altars for use so that they could practice in camp. In one of the high security detention camps, they had under the Geneva Convention a rule to have one piece of fruit per week, and one individual was able to keep one peach pit per week, enough so to make a we call it in Japanese ojuzu, but a kind of prayer beads for maintaining Buddhist practice. And so these were some of the ways that people able to take the ingredients, what they could find, and then transform and do their practice and adapt and become resilient in that sense during this very difficult time of dislocation and loss. One last example is Reverend Takahashi from one of our temples in Little Tokyo here in Los Angeles. He was writing in his diary about how he was annoyed about how the searchlights, even at night, would go over the barracks and how he couldn't sleep so well and so forth. And then over time, he would say this, that he was trying to practice meditation as if practicing meditation on the moonlit pine. I've been viewing the guards' searchlights as the Buddha's sacred light. And so he suddenly used the thing that was bothering him to help him, aid him in his komyo meditation. Is a type of meditation where you have a visualization of the moon, which represents the Buddha's enlightenment or awakening, and have it traverse your mind. And so he was using the searchlights to kind of aid him in that type of meditation practice. And so these are kind of ways that people found to survive the camp. So Buddhism may have been the thing that othered them and made them feel like they are not belonging in America, but they used it to persist, survive, and claim a place in America. And so I'm going to now go to the last thought before finishing up and going into conversation and questions. But as people returned from camp, they found, of course, many temples came under arson or temple vandalism. This is the Seattle temple. And one of the ideas that Reverend Tokunaga Kyoshiro would often talk about was that we need to repair our temples, but also we need to repair the karma of our nation. And of course, the idea of karma is quite well known. You know, like you do as an individual, one kind of positive or negative action, you'll have some kind of consequence that is also the positive or negative. But what he was referring to was the idea that it's not just an individual self, but because we, in Buddhist tradition, we believe that all beings are interlinked, that we have karma that is more than one's particular individual responsibility, but the responsibility of everyone, all beings in a community, for example, a nation. And he talked a lot in the post-war about reparations, not just for Japanese Americans, but for Black Americans, and came up with this idea of how we inherit, whether we like it or not, the positive as well as negative actions of those who've come before us, our ancestors, and that the kind of racial karma of the nation of America is multifold and multifaceted. And so today I'm talking obviously about Japanese American incarceration, but it's interlinked to China. I mentioned today the Chinese American experience, but also interlinked to many other communities' experiences all the way up to the present. And one of the metaphors in the Buddhist tradition that I want to end with comes from a ceramic kind of repair tradition in Japan, in Kyoto, from medieval times, called kintsugi. Kin in Japanese means gold. Tsugi comes from the verb tsugu, to rejoin. And I'm going to actually go to this slide. This for teacup, for example, you can see the kind of basic Buddhist philosophy behind it, which is that the Buddha taught that all things are impermanent, and nothing lasts forever, and all things therefore kind of break down. And so even if you have a valuable plate or teacup, if you drop it, the idea is instead of throwing it away, we rejoin it using lacquer. And then once we've joined those cracks and fractures, we adorn it with gold as a way to remind ourselves of the history of that teacup. And in a similar way, I think many people today, communities that face these type of things for more than a century, are facing renewed anti-Asian animus and violence and vandalism and so forth today. We've often been talking about how we have to recall and remember the layered history of this nation, the interlinked nature of how racial karma, both the positive and negative things that come either through solidarity or through fracture, continue to impact us today, and that how we have to take note and record that history and remember it but also remember not just the breakage, but the things that bind us together, the things that bring us, highlight the elements that allow us to be in solidarity and unity and togetherness with each other. And so this is maybe where I'll end, and I'm happy to expand or go in any direction. And I will now hand things over to Bob to help us do that. So thank you.
Am I on or not? No, here we go. There we are. Thank you so much for that talk. It went so fast, and you covered so much that in a certain way, I don't know where to begin, but I think what I'll do is I'll begin with the ending, the thought of that broken cup and the possibility of patching it together, and then noticing that the break actually was an opportunity to create something even more beautiful than what was there before. Right. Because it incorporates the cracking and the whole experience that seemed like the shattering of the world. And of course, right now, we're involved in this, in what seems like the shattering of the world. Things are very dangerous. People are, the wars are going on, the threat of nuclear war, the sense of civilizations falling apart. I don't mean to just concentrate on the negative aspects of this, but they certainly are negative, and it's very scary, not to mention the pandemic, of course. But that notion about breakage and repair, and repairing even better, is demonstrated so dramatically by the behavior of the Buddhists who were put in those camps, the way you describe it in the book. I'd like to just hold this book up so people can, I guess everything's backwards on it, but at any rate, can see it. And I think the cover photo of this person walking down this muddy lane in this, where is he? Gee, he seems to be in the mountains. And what are all those little symmetrical houses doing? And the sense of that being a moment in time and place where what's that person feeling? As a psychoanalyst, of course, this is a major endeavor to talk about and wonder about feelings, how they occur, how they change for the better. But what is the better? It's not like the analyst is the fount of all wisdom and the patient is just learning from the analyst. There's really a joint involvement in how one constructs or approaches reality. And what happens in the story of these of Buddhism in these camps is a cohesiveness and a sense of the group coming together, so that the affinities that they have are strengthened, maybe even more than they were before the internment phase of things, because there was a common suffering that everyone recognized in each in a unique way, but it was shared as well by everyone. What are we doing here? How were we ripped out of our homes and dropped here in the middle of the Wyoming desert, mountain desert, or whatever you want to call it? Anyway, these dilemmas of which essentially go to what is it to be human? What more is there? Is there a spiritual way which directly relates to the psychological way, or the way of being, which a person in part surrounds oneself with? Is that something that can be shared and addressed for the betterment of everyone? Where's the gold to replace the cracks in the world? And it would seem to me that, certainly Buddhism was that for these Japanese people who found themselves having come to the land of freedom of religion, declared even then by FDR, the same guy who said freedom of religion, I forget the other three freedoms, but someone will remember. But this centralized one of the major constitutional caveats of what it is to be the United States of America, what the values should be. They come to this country, they get ripped out of their homes, they get sent to concentration camps. I thought that was Nazi Germany, right? Oh, it seems to be here. And the logic or the rationale for this is all just, in retrospect, certainly it shines in the way you presented it in the book, I think, as gobbledygook. It's not like it's rational. It's just like, well, we got to blame somebody, so how about them? Ooh, I bet they're all spies and everything. And, let's be safe. Stick them up in the mountains or whatever. At least it didn't go to killing them, which the Jews had to undergo with Hitler. But that's hardly a compensation for those who had to go through it. There was another aspect of the book talking about, repair that I was wondering about as I read the book and wanted to ask you about, Duncan. Mm-hmm. And that was, you'd started off with that Buddhist premise, which I happen to agree with, about the first noble truth, the inevitability of suffering. This is part of being born a human being. And then, of course, the next steps of Buddhism is, what do you do about it? In a way, that's the next steps of any religion. Can we get that? Can we go to heaven after this is over? And in fact, I know in Britain, when Buddhism first started to be talked about in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was like, what's this religion really about? It seems like you withdraw from the world and then you can go to some place called nirvana, and that's heaven. So the whole thing was kind of Christianized, but also condemned, because it was supposed to be, well, this is a horrible world I'm in. I'll just go sit in the forest and close my eyes and put my hands together, and maybe eventually I can get out of here, get out of this place if it's the last thing we ever do. And what it didn't recognize in that early understanding, that kind of essentially condemned Buddhism from a Christian point of view, was that it's not getting out of here, it's really getting into here in a way that doesn't screen you from your affiliation, not only with other human beings, but with all sentient beings. And in sort of a line of Buddhism that's very much appealed to me, it's not just beings, it's the whole show. The physical reality of the universe is just, a part of the whole splendorous and dreadful existence of what we open our eyes to as we grow and become sort of human beings trying to figure out what to do next. But at least we have each other. And that notice of being able to be for each other first takes a form of tribalism. We all have the same color skin, so now we're a team, or we don't, and therefore, they're the bad team and we're the good team. And I think this would be common to all religions when you get right down to it. It's like, well, wait, why just the skin? Why not what it is to be you? First, your unique individuality, but then predominantly over that, the sense of the interconnection of all of us on this little teeny planet. The idea of we're all in it together, and we all affect one another. The interdependence and interbeing that's manifest among us as for our species as humans. But then in some, sort of beyond cognition, some deeper way, are each of us being manifestations of every moment that has ever happened, which brings the whole show to this moment and brings us this huge responsibility to affect the next moment. Believe it or not, I'm getting back to the question I asked you, Duncan. And how to affect the next moment is a choice about what actions you do. And if you're doing actions that are going to cause a lot of harm, think about it twice. And if you're not even thinking at all, well, maybe you should better think about that. That's ignorance. And if you're doing it just for me, that's greed. And if you're thinking about it like, oh, I can't take it anymore, well, that's avoidance. And if you don't somehow notice those three poisons and try to do something about it, you're only digging yourself and everyone around you deeper into a pit of despair and hopelessness in the long run. So, here's all these Japanese been sent to this camp. The country basically has betrayed them. You know, they came believing that here would be freedom of religion and a chance for making your way in the material world. And you don't get to. And yet, the sons of a great many of those immigrants decided to fight for America, to join the army. This was thousands of them. And in the book, you talk about the one particular case, the fellow who was in the Philippines and so on, and the torture and the horror he went through. And then I don't want to try to do the story, which you can do so much better, but what he came to at the end of all of this, when he confronted his torturers at the tail end of the war and was in charge of helping get to the basis of war crimes that had been committed. And his turn was to forgive them, essentially. But the question first is, how come there were Japanese, troops, through the army of these very sons whose parents were in the camps? They were fighting for a country that had imprisoned them and looked at them as yellow peril, perhaps, and it's the same thing going on now with the feeling because I'm Asian, I can't safely walk down the streets of New York. Fortunately, most streets you can, but nonetheless, there's this undercurrent, this viperish fear that persists to this day. And this is the mud that we dwell in. And so the mud with the lotus of realization rising out of it, and how all those soldiers decided to go, risking the bad karma of killing for, in a way, a good karma that was supposed to remedy that. Whew. You got me off on a spiel, Duncan.
Okay, very good. Well, there's many facets to your wonderful reflection, and so one thing you ended on there about the mud and the lotus flower, I think is in our Buddhist lineages we have like three major styles of thinking about the relationship between the mud and the lotus. And the mud is, metaphorically the kind of the world of difficulty and suffering and the poisons, as you mentioned, and the kind of idea of a lotus flower kind of rising above that muddy pond and kind of blossoming above. And so, representing the kind of awakening and liberation of the Buddha. And so that's why so many Buddhist statuary have, underneath the Buddha, the lotus flower and so forth. So that metaphor is certainly central to many of our traditions, but that different traditions interpret it a little bit differently. So some lineages talk about the importance of that kind of rising above it kind of idea. Others talk about the idea that the lotus flower and the mud are in fact interlinked. Like you can't have a lotus flower. A friend of mine actually has a lotus farm, and if you put a lotus flower in a sterile water, it won't prosper. It needs the nutrients from the mud to kind of rise up, and so some traditions focus on that, and then other traditions even go as far as to say, the mud and the lotus it's just one big circle, and so the liberation is not anywhere other than here, kind of, I think is kind of what you were intimating as well. So that's another line of thinking. And yeah. So I think there's a wonderful teaching in all of that. But I remember in one example I talk about in the book about a Buddhist priest who was arrested on Pearl Harbor Day in his own robes. They didn't even give him time to pack a bag of suitcase with clothes and whatever. So he was doing a Buddha's birthday sermon in April. So this December 7th arrest, April, 4 months, later, he's still in these dirty robes, and he references this metaphor about the lotus in the mud, and he talks about how his robes are so dirty, but that how we can, even in the context of being in a camp like he was, even being in dirty robes, that can be the, how should we say, fuel for the practice and for liberation. In Japanese Buddhist context, often because Japan is such a volcanic nation, it's a series of islands created by volcano. There's only hot springs. 2/3 of the world's hot springs are in Japan, and so people often use the metaphor of like magma by itself. It can be very disruptive, but when you can touches the water, it can become a healing, hot spring that's helpful. And so I think a lot of the work of repair, the work of how to deal with difficulty has to do with, you mentioned, where's the gold, what's the water that's going to touch the difficulty to transform it. And I think those are the type of things that back in World War II, people found different resources in their own teachings and their rituals and practices, but also, as you kind of intimated, their community. That sometimes liberation, we have think of Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. We have three kind of treasures or refuges in our particular faith tradition, and that last one, Sangha, means community. That it's very important. One of the three most important, because there's a recognition that although, yes, ultimately we have to take, responsibility and so forth for our how we lead our lives, we don't ever come to liberation alone. That it's done in community. It's done with the community of those around us today. It's also done with those who've come before us, teachers and teachers of teachers and ancestors, that we exist not as atomized persons, but the Buddhist approach is to say we are interlinked with all sentient, all beings, not just in our time, but with times past, and therefore with times future as well. And so with that in mind, I think we find hopefully different water to hit the fire, different kinds of medicine to hit the illness, different kinds of gold to or lacquer to deal with the fractures and fissures of ourselves and our families and our communities. And so this is, I think, as a general point, your reflection helped me to see these are the type of things that back then people did, but also today in our temple, in our community's temples, we often find we talk about teaching, like perspective change. That's one big medicine, and then a sense of feeling in community. That's another big medicine, and that together they can work in combination to help us walk the path of freedom together. So sometimes I do say, as a kind of joke to my youth group at the time, like if you had to summarize Buddhism in just a simple formula, just say wisdom times compassion equals freedom. And it comes from actually a classic Buddhist metaphor in a text that talks about a bird trying to fly. That one wing is the wing of wisdom and the other wing is the wing of compassion. And to take off, you need both wings. And I was like, we presume that suffering and the end of suffering is the purpose of our faith life, but that in America, instead of calling it awakening, enlightenment, or even liberation, maybe we should use the word freedom, because not many people are anti-freedom. So I always like to say, for Buddhists to be able to belong in America better, we should just skillfully adapt and say wisdom times compassion equals freedom, then people will not be too upset at, even if they have a different vantage point.
We've asked people to put questions in the Q&A box, and I think you may have already anticipated some of these in your last answer, but I'd like to read them. One is, Duncan, thank you. I wonder your response from a Buddhist perspective on white fear stemming from unconscious guilt and shame of retribution by the Japanese that unravels the distinction of being American. Whether Hiroshima and Nagasaki or the bombing of Baghdad after 9/11 and anti-Muslim sentiment, the irrational fear leads to irrational destructiveness. Can you say more of how these complexities are reconciled from a Buddhist perspective?
Yes, thank you for that question. There's the specifics of what was going on in terms of, what some people term war hysteria or fear at that time, kind of sometimes whipped up in the media of the period, other times, legitimate fears of invasion. All these things are, how do you parse the things that are legitimate and things that are kind of not necessary or in fact kind of delusional? And so I think that's number one. The first kind of responsibility from a Buddhist vantage point is to notice what is legitimate and not, and what is just extra, and being able to see things clearly. That's what I mean by when I said wisdom times, like wisdom means simply we have a clear way, not how things might be, ought to be, but just how things actually are is one kind of helpful. We have many different ways of doing it. Meditation is one, chanting, the different styles of practice in Buddhism. But the idea, no Buddhist would disagree that seeing things clearly, not delusionally, as the terms I use in the text, is the pathway to distinguishing between fear that is legitimate and not. But I think the question brings up a kind of bigger point about kind of fear in kind of like a intergeneration, like it's sometimes not just one's particular time and moment, and post 9/11 is like this, and post Pearl Harbor is like that, and this media context is like this, and therefore the rise in fear and animus goes up. But there's also things that I feel are passed down, transmit. This is what I was trying to get at with the karma of the nation idea. Like some things that, whether we like it or not, whether one is an Asian American, a white American, a Black American, whatever it is, we are from our parents and our and so we have certain fears that are sometimes mental stances, but other times even almost like in our body, somatic. It's in our bodies of fear, and that's linked to racialized, understandings of how we relate to each other. And so it could be a Black American person, despite having absolute clarity on it, has a fear of seeing a white police officer in a certain kind of context. It's maybe passed down, and so I think that's another part that if we're going to actually deal with things in a more deep way, we have to come to terms as a nation, whatever our background, with all of it, and trying to tackle fears and prejudices and other things that if how should we say, transmitted to the next generation without any kind of transformation, we just repeat a certain kind of karmic patterns around race and discrimination and othering. And so there is, I think, some ways that we can all work together to what can we do in our time, in our generation, with each other. We don't come to this kind of freedom alone, so we have to do it together, but it's not always easy. But these are the type of things I think, I don't know, I would reflect on beyond that one particular case of World War II.
I'd like to make a comment on that as well. I really like you reducing it to freedom, the sense of like, oh, I'm wanting greater freedom. And in a sense, the inheritance of your culture, or being told from the time you're born who you are and here's what the values are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The whole thing being thrown on you is a way of closing your eyes or putting blinders on. Mm. And so I wonder if you have ever thought about psychoanalysis as essentially another path, related path towards the same endeavor of seeing things clearly. In that, when you go to a therapy, you could say, a patient comes in and wants treatment because I'm stuck. I keep doing the same things, repetition. I'm still, not able to do this or that, or I can't get rid of my depression, or, whatever it is. But that feeling of being stuck and wanting to be free of that stuckness, what do you do about it? And then you can make a case, as I have done, that the psychoanalysis, woven into it as a form of treatment, is an effort to see things more clearly, to notice the habits. And you do this by having a therapist there. So it's another point of view. And there are ways where it will overlap and not overlap with your point of view. And it's not like the therapist is necessarily going to be right and you're going to be wrong. So it's not being led to a different point of view. That would be just another kind of prison. But it would be developing the capacity, which would be true of meditation certainly as well, central to meditation, of at the same time, you have that little capacity to step back a bit in your mind and say, oh, there am I. So there's an observer you, and that's part of the regular you, but there's a little distance that opens up, which is creating room for freedom, to see it differently, to change perspectives. And I think in the long run, where Buddhism, from my point of view, carries it, if you further that, you begin to realize that closing into one point of view after another is itself a kind of a habit of mind that can be seen for what it is too. And if you start seeing things really clearly, you could say that's enlightenment. But that's a real push from just feeling better after a year's therapy, say, unless you're lucky, I guess.
Right. But well, this is why, I think we often say we should try to, for example, practice meditation together with other people. And the reason for that is meditation, for example, if you have difficulty or different thing that these days I'm having problem at work, or my spouse is and everything seems to be closing in. It's like this. Meditation is the thing that helps you open up just a little vantage point to see past the thing that's blocking. And so that's the power, I think, of meditation, is kind of like we can see possibility. It's when we can't even imagine possibility, that's when we're truly stuck. And so part of meditation is just opening, we call it opening the hands, but it's not to gain something. It's often to let go of something. And so it's important to release, and we call it opening the hand, but like release as it is to like, I'm going to gain insight, or I'm going to gain X or Y or Z. It's more like releasing some things that are unnecessary, that's blocking the view, that's obstructing. And so that's one bit. But the in-community part has to do, I think, as Bobby just said, about like, I guess, I apologize, I don't know so much about psychoanalysis and this kind of thing, but in when I said earlier about Sangha and community, that we do things together, very well-known kind of image we have about doing that is like when you are in the monastic kitchen, you're on potato cleaning duty. You can kind of clean the potato one at a time, get the dirt off, get the little, you can kind of or you can put a whole bunch of potatoes inside a pail of water and just rub up against each other, and they become clean. So that's sangha. That's rubbing up against each other, talking with each other, becoming a mirror to each other. That's how we come to know ourselves, but also let go of things that are unneeded. And so that's the kind of purpose of, sometimes there's a purpose of doing things, by oneself, but there's also a value to doing things together. And so I can see how maybe psychoanalysis is doing things together, talking and doing things with other people who may be able to shake loose some of those things.
Thank you. I'll never wash potatoes the same way again.
Well, it's also reminding me after 9/11 and healing from trauma in the early stages, we often say, being in community is the best first step in terms of healing, the comfort of being with others. So I similar perspective of psychoanalytic view and psychological view and what you were saying, Duncan. We also have another question maybe related to that about people were wondering how the community healed after they were released from the detention camps, and were there specific things they did or prayers that they said. How did they? I'm sure the healing process was a long time, but is there anything you can say about that?
So there was, I would say, a couple different registers where healing worked itself out. So for example, initially after the war, kind of basically everybody tried to not talk about what happened. And many people who were born in camp or born after camp often would say their parents, they lost their businesses, like everything all the loss and difficulty, even in kind of reintegrating back into the West Coast or wherever they ended up after camp, was not easy. But they refused to kind of talk about it, and in a way, it's a kind of like parental feeling of like, I don't want to transmit, or kind of like I don't want to I want to give my kid a chance to develop beyond that context. But eventually it always tends to catch up, right? But there was a period in the 50s, 60s, where nobody talked about it. And then suddenly there was a kind of movement in the 60s and 70s, and ultimately ends up in 1988 in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that President Ronald Reagan signs. It's a congressional piece of legislation that was the redress and reparations bill that was passed by Congress. And so I think that was something that was healing to the community, in the sense that prior to that piece of legislation passing, often for the first time there was a commission that was set up by Congress that went around the nation to hear camp survivors' experiences, testimony. And that kind of, often the kids were hearing it for the first time, what was going on. And I think that kind of public expression in communities helped to heal people. Now, if the question is, so is there a Buddhist aspect to, there's a kind of political aspect that register, there's a kind of community aspect of openly being able to discuss these experiences and so forth. But I think one of the most powerful things I participated in personally was I would go down to Texas and to Oklahoma, like different places on the kind of southern border. There was, as you may all know, like 2019, a lot of people were concerned about the separation of children from their families, and on the southern border, people seeking asylum in America. And camp survivors from the Japanese American World War II experience, they're all in the 80s, or they're kind of elderly. they also had their fathers taken away by the FBI. They experienced family separation in these kind of detention facilities, and many of them was like, nobody really spoke up for us back in World War II, but we're gonna fold paper cranes, a Japanese kind of symbol of hope, and many of them, like tens of thousands, and place them on these fence lines of the Border Patrol and ICE detention facilities. And what I remember, the co-founder of this movement called Tsuru, which means crane, so they're making paper cranes, Tsuru for Solidarity. One of the co-founders had used color photocopy of the front cover of my book to make the cranes and put them on. So that's how I came to know of it. But then another co-founder would say, when her dad was taken away by the FBI and put into these and then the rest of the family went to a different camp, and they experienced family separation, she felt like the only way to actually heal that was to fold paper cranes today for these Central American migrant families. And so that was a very interesting thing about kind of how does intergenerational stuff work, and how does healing work, that where maybe you're not directly addressing X, but you find a way to address a thing a little bit adjacent, and that has a curious, because of our interconnected, like curious way of attending to the original bit of trauma or tension. So anyway, I just mentioned that as something that I've heard camp survivors talk about from a kind of Buddhist perspective of how to handle these type of things in their own families. Is sometimes you attend to it directly, sometimes you attend to it a little bit later, sometimes you find a positive alternative to build up so it counterbalances, and then other times you actually do a different action that seems unrelated but actually is linked up.
Mm-hmm. That also reminds me of something that we suggest to trauma survivors as in the psychotherapeutic process of volunteering or helping. But as you pointed out, there needs to be a link and something that comes from within that promotes that action. We have some more questions, Duncan. Let's see. What are your thoughts on the integration of Buddhist principles in a westernized way through the prevalence of discussion of mindfulness in mainstream pop culture, as well as in psychotherapy and mental health practices?
Thank you for that question. It's a little bit, for me, a complicated thing. I have friends who served I have a friend who served 3 tours in Afghanistan and was in the Marine Corps. And he was talking about, at a certain point, they were introducing, I guess for the sniper program, Buddhist, like mindfulness, kind of like breathing technique and awareness program to help people shoot better. And I was like, that seems to be on the spectrum of things, probably the worst example of how to adapt Buddhist things for American, cultural / social things that seem, outside of, obviously we do it within our temple or our meditation center, but if it's going to be translated to outside the temple, that seems to be the worst example of it. There are probably other examples of, how should we say, taking something from the Buddhist tradition, secularizing it, and applying it in other contexts beyond the temple that may also lean a little bit towards that kind of disassociation with ethics. In our lineage, we often like to emphasize, like, you're not doing the meditation for your own person. Like it's not just for you, it's helping you become a person that you can be in good relation with everyone. And so because if you find out who you are and figure out your difficulties, and I mentioned the ingredients in the kitchen, like you figure out what are the kind of rotting ingredients in it, like figuring that stuff out is actually not just for you, it's for everyone. And there's ethical dimension to why we practice mindfulness or meditation. So it's not kind of dissociated, but how should we say, there are ways that it's been dissociated that I feel, so let's say, I don't know, there might be some corporate ones that are, like for example, I talked to Roger Rossner at Apple, and I think the way they're doing integration of mindfulness and so on Apple is actually pretty good. But there are other kind of corporate entities out there, which is all about like, how do you do the mindfulness about stress reduction and whatever, but it's really about worker productivity and concentration so that you can become a more productive, worker in the corporate unit. And that seems also a little bit on the side of the spectrum that seems too far distant from my taste about, translating mindfulness into the American kind of economy of, industries and so forth. So I guess you can tell from my response, like, I feel like some things are perfectly fine to kind of take it out of the temple context and, adapt it. Why not? If it's helpful, if it's going to reduce suffering, alleviate suffering in any way, in any shape or form, that's all, Buddhists will be always for that, But if it's to take that extreme case of helping a sniper kill people better, more efficiently, that's kind of like not in alignment with our general goal of trying to alleviate suffering in the world.
Wow. Okay, there's another question about perhaps someone's asking that you say something about Buddhism being not monolithic, and that there are many different sects and sometimes almost incompatible practices. And was that also happening with the internees? How did they work that out?
Yes. So for example, just with what do you chant during a morning service or something like that, ceremony? Different lineages of Buddhism chant different things. In the Nichiren tradition, they say Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge. In the Jodo, Jodo Shu, Jodo Shinshu, they chant Namamiro, Namamiro. And then my sect, we chant. So in the camps, they were forced to be in one. All the Buddhists were just kind of apropos Bob's point about Roosevelt and the Four Freedoms. Once they realized like majority of the community is Buddhist and they have to give at least some space for Buddhists to practice, they were given a space, but they were told you have to work together. And so one of the things they did was they came up with a way of chanting Namu Butsu, which is like homage to the Buddha. So they found nobody ever actually chants that in regular life, but in camp, they found a way to kind of find a common ground so that there's their lineage specific chanting, they couldn't do it. So ultimately they found ways to work together. And this is often the case in American Buddhism. When you have regions of the country where you have lots of lineages, then those lineage or sectarian differences can live side by side, and it actually matters more. But when you live in a region where either like an internment camp or just even now, a region of the country where there are not so many lineages of Buddhism, and you kind of, just to survive, you have to kind of work together. People find ways to how should we say, accommodate each other and find ways so that those differences between sectarian styles becomes less heightened or emphasized. And so I think that's just a general kind of thing of like, when you're forced to work together, you kind of just have to work together. And when you have the luxury of having lots of different diversity, being able to, as different lineages thrive. For example, here in LA, we have Cambodian Buddhists right next to Tibetan Buddhists, right next to historic Chinese American, like every form of Buddhism is here. And there's the luxury of being able to freely practice all our different specific styles today in a place like LA, in a way that even if you think about Bangkok or Shanghai or Kyoto or whatever, they don't have all these lineages in one place. It's somewhere like the United States, like LA, or New York that have all these people rubbing up against each other and able to kind of be not monolithic, but in their full diversity.
Thank you. We're approaching our stop time, and before I want to conclude, I want to thank you both. I just the history that you gave, Duncan. I wonder about our future here, that we don't teach those things. We don't teach the history. Even the Act of 1881, and without being educated about this, how are we going to change? And that there are some forces that don't even want people, particularly white people, to feel uncomfortable. So they suppress the knowledge or the awareness of anything that makes us uncomfortable. So thank you for sharing the history with us today, and hopefully we can continue to share it and be aware and not dissociate or suppress those feelings that Bob, you were talking about. And I'd also like to invite everyone to join us again on May 21st, when we will, our guest will be Hindu Omaru Ibrahim from Chad, and our discussant will be Tom Hennis. Hindu Ibrahim is an indigenous woman from the Maboro pastoralist community in Chad, and an expert in adaptation and mitigation of indigenous people and women in relation to climate change, traditional knowledge, and the adaptation of pastoralists in Africa. She also successfully organized indigenous peoples to negotiate at the Paris Agreement for Climate Change. So I thank you all for being with us here today. And as you go forth, be safe and be well. And thank you, Duncan, and thank you, Bob.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.